Nice. Welcome everyone, and please, if you just arrived, make yourself a seat if you can and feel comfortable. First let me tell you that it's so very nice to see so many faces around today. You know, for someone like me, it is unusual and sometimes it's a little bit strange to see that people are still coming to hearing me talk. I mean, as well, they may think they know what I'm going to say before I open my mouth. Now, the thing is, often I don't know what I'm going to say before I open my mouth, except for the occasional bits of paper on which I write odd notes and guidelines, like those ones. It's a funny thing, huh? You live your life shaped by your values and experiences and a belief system that has served you well over the years. You pick up labels, you're left or you're right, you're a radical or a conservative, you're dynamic and charismatic, or you are dull and steady and the salt of the earth, and all those labels stick to you. But they don't really mean anything. In the end, in the very end, it is what you've done and what you've left behind which is important. Not where you come from and all the labels they can stick on you, but what you have achieved to make this a better world, and whether you have been honorable and decent in your dealing with the men and women you came in contact with. None of us can know exactly what is in store for us, even tomorrow, not to mention in 2 or 5 years from now on. But I think it's probably safe for me to say that the greatest achievements of my life are behind me. So it is an opportune moment to reflect a little on what got me to this place and time. I guess you could say that I've been fighting against the odds ever since I saw the light of day, or even before that. You see, at my birth, I apparently took so long to show any signs of life that my mother had given up all interest in me, as she believed me to be dead. But my female relatives would not give in so easily. They were determined to put life into me and proceeded to make as much noise as they could using cymbal and other instruments, and in the same time jolting me about, even stuffing a banana into my mouth in an effort to make me cough and so draw breath. They finally succeeded in arousing my interest, and their job completed handed me back to my anxious mother, a yelling and kicking Saturday's child. From an early age, I spent most of my free time in the fields playing and fighting with the other kids of the village. It is in the fields that I learned how to knock birds out of the sky and to catch fishes with twine and sharpen bits of wires. I learned how to stick fights and became quite adept at its various techniques. I learned how to do parrying blows, fighting in one direction and striking in another, even breaking away from an opponent with good footwork. Both my parents conditioned us to be tough in order to survive whatever life might throw at us. They expected all of us to stand up for ourselves. Once my mother noticed that I was reluctant to go outside and play. Sometimes I came in crying, complaining that the kid across the street was always punching me around. I was only 4 years old, but my mother was afraid that if I gave in to my fear, it would set a pattern for the rest of my life. One day I came running into the house. She stopped me. "Go back out there," she said, "and if that kid hits you, you have my permission to hit him back. You have to stand up for yourself. There is no room in this house for a coward." She later told me that she watched me from behind the dining room curtain as I squared my shoulders and marched across the street. I returned home a few minutes later, glowing with victory. I can play with the kids now, I said, and they will be my friends. I learned early that crying out in protest could accomplish things. My older brother and sister had started to school when sometimes they would come in asking for a butter biscuit or something, and my mother impatiently would tell them no. But I would cry out loud and make such a fuss that I got what I wanted. So, I remember that famous day that my mother asked me why I couldn't be such a nice boy as my brother. But I would think to myself that he, for being so nice and so quiet, often stayed hungry. I had learned in life early that if you want something, you had better make some noise. Many years later, I adapted that strategy to the political games in which I found myself. It wasn't always enough just to make more noise than others. It had to be provocative. I only managed to really be effective when I was regarded by others as irresponsible. And since I've been some kind of a leader, I've been more reassured each time I was resisted or attacked harder, because each time made me more certain that I was on the right track. I also learned at a young age to be alert to betrayal. In my country, children learn about being on guard at an early age. Things are not always as they seem, and even a small slip can be fatal. You must be strong, clever, suspicious. You must obey the rules of the clan. Years ago, fresh out of university, I thought that politics was a truly noble pursuit, and that the institutions of democracy were humanity's means to better the world. I still think that's true, but I've learned that, like any other kind of human pursuit, politics can be an ugly game. Clan against clan, party against party, candidate against candidate, with the government falling over trivial issues. But there was another lesson, one that I processed with a rather different way. I like to be anywhere but at home. Home represented authority, and that triggered my sense of revolt, and the rebel spirit began to emerge. I didn't like authority, because in those days there was lots of corporal punishment. A slap on the head, a belt taken to you. We always run that risk, although we gradually learn to defend ourselves against it. Our family was fairly well off, but my father couldn't have accumulated so much wealth without a strong character and great determination. Like most immigrants, he was hardworking, modest, with a spirit of humility. My father felt very strongly that it was only proper to share his good fortune with those who hadn't been so lucky. There are many stories of his generosity and his kindness, of a man with a good heart who would always help his friends, neighbors, laborers, people who were having a hard time. Sometimes he'd complain, he'd grumble, but he never let anyone leave the house without an answer to their problem. It may sound strange for me to say, but one of the characteristics that I always admire about him was what you might call his nobility. He had an extraordinary effect on people. Whenever he spoke, his one leg dropped over the other, his large hands outstretched to direct or deflect attention, his voice deep and sure, cajoling and laughing. I would see a sudden change take place in the family. My grandfather became more vigorous and thoughtful. My mother more bashful. Even my grandmother, smoked out of the foxhole of her bedroom, went with him and started sparring about politics. It was as if his presence had brought back the spirit of earlier times, as if war and riots and famines were nothing more than a temporary setback, and there was nothing to fear but fear itself. It fascinated me, this strange power of my father. Sometimes in the evening, he'll gather all three of us children together and talk to us about the importance of God and good behavior. He encouraged us to ask questions. My father hated what he called stupid learning, learning by rote. And if my mother, that why drove there crazy, but my father loved it. He would ponder a question for just a moment and then commence with a lengthy lecture. We would listen to him, seated in awe, pretending that it was all clear to us, even if the 9/10 of the time it was way above our heads. I was the child of the landowner, but my parents didn't behave like typical landowners, and they didn't even really mingle or associate with the other landowners of the district. They didn't have the culture of the custom of the family of the wealthy class. And so I didn't acquire bourgeois culture. By the time I was 13, I was helping to guard in the fields at night, sitting in the dark, armed with a club and wearing an engraved dagger my father had given to me. Spending the nights alone added to that sense of self-sufficiency I was already acquiring. I loved it. I felt in control, a feeling that was not diminished when one night I suddenly saw a shadow, a movement, and staring into the darkness, recognized my father, obviously coming to check if I was all right. How many times did he spend there with me, unobserved? I don't know. I never told him I saw him. Even if I didn't understand it in political or ideological terms, I was touched by the poverty I saw all around me. I remember perhaps I was 14 or 15, passing a long queue of people seeking for work. Although times were very hard, my father still managed to provide for us. But naturally, we knew people who were much worse off, who had lost their jobs and really didn't know where the next meal was coming from. And what struck me then, and what stayed with me, was how neatly turned out the children of those unemployed families were. Their parents were determined to make all the sacrifices that were necessary for them. The spirit of self-reliance, of independence, was so strong in even the poorest families. I think that image of dignity in the face of adversity remained with me and has strongly influenced my professional life as a political person. What I came to believe was that a society that encourages such virtues as effort, thrift, independence, family obligation, will tend to produce people who have a greater self-esteem and are therefore happier, as well as not being a burden to others, than the people living in a society that encourages them how to feel useless, depressed, demoralized, and frustrated. But even if that were not the case, I feel that the state and society must be just, as well as compassionate, and willing to help out the ones left on the side of the road. Having seen all that poverty, I don't minimize in the slightest the importance of material needs. And this was clear and understood by me from my early age. In order to make something of yourself in life, to improve your situation, to get an education, you first of all need to meet your physical and material needs. But at the same time, and I guess that too came from my father and what I saw growing up, what really in those days determined the quality of life was not what you had, it was about knowledge and culture. Values, they don't have to be bourgeois values, are what determine the true quality of life. This was reinforced a little bit later as I myself prepared to leave my country to attend university. My father gave me a beautiful volume of sacred writing as a going-away present. He said to me, you will see many things abroad that will surprise you, and some which may even shock you. But I know you have the ability to adapt. Above all, you must study hard. Very few in our country have got this privilege you now have, and you must make the best out of it. Never forget that the money it is costing you to send you comes from the land, from the people who sweat and toil on this land. You will owe a debt to them, a debt you can repay with God's blessing by using your education to better their lives. And those words remained with me and inspired me in everything I tried to achieve later in life. That community servicing was not something you did to feel good about yourself, but rather something you did to repay the debt you owe to those less fortunate, but who also made their contribution to build a society in which you might enjoy the benefits of education and a little bit of comfort and prosperity. Well, that's how I came to believe what I believe and to fight for those beliefs. But of course, my career was shaped as well by the ways that I fought that fight. I don't think I knew as a child that I would be where I am now. Of course, I had my useful dreams and fantasy, but again, whose boys doesn't have? I recall that as a 10 years old, I acquired a wonderful album on Napoleon. I played with it for several years. I looked at those images. I imagined those famous battles. Naturally, it was a great entertainment. And I was crazy about Napoleon, Hannibal, Alexander the Great, and all those people that the elementary school books never ceased to write about. Perhaps one thing is revealing. Back then, I wished Hannibal had taken Rome. Maybe because of his daring crossing the Alps with his elephants, or maybe just because he was the underdog. I also like the Spartans and their defense of the gates of the Thermopylae with only 300 men. Yes, as all boys, I liked military leaders, warriors. So there I was, after returning home, following my graduation, a bright young man out of my own, with a whole life in front of me. Not a whole lot different from many other bright young men who began their studies in the same time as I had. Not a whole lot different, I suppose, than many of you here when you began your studies 5 or 10 years ago, or maybe, like me, many years ago. Or maybe, in a few cases, as some of you today here, just beginning life away from the nest. Do you think that I imagined then what lay ahead? Because if you do, well, then let me tell you, I guess the propagandists and the mythmakers have done a really good job. Because in those days, I was just another student, fond of the ladies, enjoying a drink or going to a film, with a lot of ideas rattling around the back of my head, but no real notion of what I ought to be doing with those ideas and what I would do in the world. But I did love to talk about ideas. So I took up with a crowd of youngsters and friends, people who gathered in cafes and private homes to talk about politics and where our country was heading. We all knew that change was necessary and that it could never happen if we just accepted everything as it was. A mass meeting was called, and I was asked to make a speech. I had never done anything like this before, but I agreed. I prepared my speech, and on the day of the meeting, believe me, I felt so nervous as I waited to address the crowd. I didn't know who would be there, or if they would listen, or even if I had anything to say. I was in a trance-like state when I first mounted the stage. For I don't know how long, I just stood there, the sun in my eyes, facing a crowd of a few hundred people, restless. A couple of them were swinging a frisbee, the others standing on the side, watching. I took a breath. Without waiting for a cue, I stepped up to the microphone. "There is a struggle going on," I said. A few people looked up. I waited for the crowd to quiet down. My voice had barely carried until the first few rows. I said, there is a struggle going on. The frisbee players stopped. People started watching. It's a struggle that touches each and every one of us. A struggle that demands that we choose sides. Not between black and white, not between rich and poor. No, it's a harder choice than that. It's a choice between dignity and servitude, between fairness and injustice, between commitment and indifference, a choice between right and wrong. I stopped. The crowd was quiet now, watching me. Somebody started to clap. Go with it! Somebody else shouted. Tell it like it is. Then the others started to join in, clapping, cheering, and I knew that I had them, that the connection had been made, established. Perhaps then, after all, I'd inherited something of that magical quality of my father's. I was gradually drawn deeper and deeper into the movement. The situation with the government was getting worse and worse. Our organization was a collective, but the government had made it impossible for us to function effectively as a collective. I came to a conclusion that it was time to take action, but I didn't have the security or the time to discuss this decision with my organization. As a child, I had learned a great deal about leadership, watching the tribal meetings that were held in the town square when difficult decisions had to be made. Everyone who wanted to speak could do so. It was democracy in its purest forms. Everyone was heard. People spoke without interruption, and the meeting often lasted many hours. I was astonished by the candor with which people criticized the leader. But no matter how flagrant the charge, he simply listened, not defending himself, showing no emotion at all. I always remember his axiom. A leader, he said, it's like a shepherd. He stays behind the flock, letting the most nimble go out ahead, whereupon the others follow, not realizing that all along they were directed from behind. But now, I wasn't even sure where the flock was. In a sense, that may have been God sent, for I felt sure that if I had taken my plan over to my colleagues, they would have condemned it, and I would have killed it even before I was born. It was a twist on that lesson I had learned as a child. There are times when a leader must move out ahead of the flock, go off in a new direction, confident that he is leading his people in the right way. I wasn't oblivious to how fateful was the decision I had taken. I abhor violence, but we had no alternative to armed and violent resistance. And of course, we were not talking here about knocking a bird out of the sky or fighting each other with sticks we had gathered on the fields. The fact is, however, that over and over again, we had used all the non-violent weapons in our arsenal. Speeches, deputations, march, threats, stairways, strikes, voluntary imprisonment. But whatever we did was met by an iron fist. A freedom fighter learns the hard way that it is the oppressor who defines the nature of the struggle, and the oppressed is often left with no choice but to use the methods that mirrors those of the oppressors. For me, non-violence was not a moral principle, but a strategy. There is no moral goodness in using an ineffective weapon. I told you, as a child, I'd been fascinated by the ancient battles, but now it was no longer make-believe. For us, guerrilla warfare was the detonator of a process whose objective was the revolutionary takeover of power. I always trusted in the possibilities of irregular war. Throughout history, in all wars since the times of Hannibal and Alexander the Great, victory was always within the grasp of those who used the wiles of secrecy in their movement and surprised their enemy with their deployments of men and arms, terrain and tactics. Obviously, we faced great dangers. Self-discipline and bravery were probably the two most important qualities you needed in the struggle. I felt a little comforted thinking back to our initiation, this ritual of circumcision we all underwent to prove our manhood. I can recall that day almost like it was yesterday. At dawn, when the stars were still in the sky, we began our preparation. I was tense and anxious, uncertain of how I would react at that critical moment. But flinching or crying was considered as a sign of weakness, and I was determined not to disgrace myself or my comrades. Circumcision is a trial of bravery and stoicism. No anesthetic is used. You must suffer in silence. But I do have to confess that small act of bravery was nothing like the courage I witnessed during the struggle. It is from my comrades during those hard times that I learned the meaning of courage. Time and again, I've seen men and women risking and giving their lives for an idea, standing up to attacks and tortures without breaking, showing a strength and resiliency that defies the imagination. I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over fear itself. I felt fear myself, more than I can remember, but I hid it behind a mask of boldness. There were many acts of bravery and a great deal of suffering. And in the end, we succeeded in our struggle. It seemed to me to be a good time to withdraw from politics. And I did, but in the end, not for that long. As I watched our young democracy developing, I grew increasingly frustrated. And I thought to myself, this is not what we struggled so hard to achieve, but what should I do? Yes, I could speak out, but it's likely that my voice would be drowned out by others who could scream louder. Or perhaps I could run for parliament, but I knew so little about the political games that were played, and I was not at all sure that I was suited to it. How did it happen then that despite this ambivalence, I took the plunge? It's a curious story. The fact is, I needed a push to enter the elections. And when finally I got one, it didn't come from political advisors or leaders. I was attending an event promoting women in sport. We gathered with dozens of young women athletes who were assembled on a stage under a giant banner saying, "Dare to compete." The captain of the girls' basketball team introduced me. As I went to shake her hand, she leaned over me and whispered in my ear. "Dare to compete," she said. "Dare to compete." Her comment caught me off guard. So much confusion that I left the event and began to think. Could I be afraid to do something I had urged countless others to do? Why am I vacillating about entering an election campaign? Why aren't I thinking more seriously about it? Maybe I should dare to compete. Struggling with what I knew would be a life-altering decision, I could not help but to reflect on what my father had told me when I left the country to begin my studies, that this was something I owed to the people. There really was no choice, I understood, so I threw my hat in the ring. The only thing I was certain was that the future was uncertain. Anything might happen. I could get arrested, gunned down on the airport tarmac during my campaign, but I did what I had to do, and I was determined to fulfill my pledge to the people to stand by them in their democratic aspirations. I was taking the risk for the children of our countries. It was not about personal power. It was about simple decency and respect for the right of men and women to live in security and dignity and in liberty. I found it difficult to play the handshaking, baby-kissing, crowd-pleasing role that the strategists had choreographed for me. Nevertheless, I did what was expected from me, and I was reasonably successful in concealing my embarrassment. Perhaps the most important impression that was made on me during my childhood time was that the people that are called to serve their community, and that, for the sake of the cause that they are serving, are the ones who are asked to make the sacrifices. So I did, and our campaign approach went well. Turnouts were good. We succeeded in generating genuine enthusiasm amongst many of our supporters. In the process, I developed a very warm relationship with them. And so I was elected. And I took my seat in Parliament with a bit of fear and trepidation, but also the feeling that it just might make a difference. Just about all my life, I've had a real obsession about telling the truth. I am what you might call a pathological truth teller. It's another one of those traits I can trace back to the powerful influence of my father. When we were children, my father taught us to be honest because truth is good in itself. If we kids behave badly, I always took the lead in owning up. I would say, "You won't punish us if I confess something, will you? Because if I do tell the truth and you punish me, then you'd be forcing me to lie to you next time." In fact, I've probably suffered over the years because of this obsession with truth-telling. Some of you may recall how it was that I stepped down and stepped away from the Parliament seat I was occupying. I had confessed in a newspaper interview many years earlier that I once told a fib to save my neck. And now, somehow, this interview had been dredged up to embarrass me. I didn't consider that little fib as a lie, since it was a matter of life and death. There was a meeting of the caucus in Parliament. Everyone had read my newspaper, and they were furious. That morning, a party member came to see me and said, "When the caucus starts, people will attack you, but I want you to stay quiet. When it's your time to speak, you will say, 'This interview was made a long time ago, before I even got elected. I am sorry. I now realize that things are not this way, and it doesn't work in that sense. From now on, I will consult the party before coming out with such a thing.'" Yeah. When some of my colleagues in Parliament started saying nasty things, I stayed quiet. But then one man looked over to the party leader and asked, "Don't you think we should protect him against himself?" I saw red. I got up and said, "What surprised me is that not one person in this whole assembly has asked me if what I said in this interview was true." After the meeting, a member of the party came to see me and said, "What have you done? Why did you say those things?" I told him, "Because it's true, and I'm not going to apologize about the truth." I had put great hopes in parliamentary route, but now I felt a deep sense of disappointment. So much needed to be done, but I had to ask myself whether it was possible with that level of deceit and dishonesty. As it turned out, others intervened to help me with my decision. It was almost like when I first saw the light of day, when what seemed like hopelessness, was rescued with the help of others. Word that somehow preceded me outside of the government building. Outside, I was confronted by an excited crowd. "Resign," they shouted as soon as they saw me. "Resign and lead us, and we shall complete that struggle together." I realized at once that they were sincere and determined. Above all, I knew that they needed me to lead them. I had stirred their deepest feeling, and they had shown their confidence in me. I could never fail them now. Quickly, I made my mind up. "I will lead you," I said. "This very day, I will lead you." As you know, my resignation was not an end, but a new beginning. Freed of the shackles of parliamentary politics, I was able to achieve a great deal more. But still, it wasn't always easy, and there were many moments when I asked myself if it was worth it. Perhaps I should walk away. But when I saw the weakness of the leadership, the hypocrisy, the hatred within my country, when I saw the development throughout the world, I thought that I simply had to stay. As long as I still had a chance to be on guard and play the role of silent monitor, perhaps as my father had done when I was a kid playing in the fields or guarding, there seemed no real alternative. And so I stayed, and I rose through the ranks, and finally my colleagues flattered me with the request that I took on leadership. The journey was almost complete. But of course, as a leader, you still have to struggle for what you believe in. Sometimes those discussions were very intense. Naturally, I pushed very hard for my ideas and for what I believe in. I looked to the example of my father, to be caring and kind, but to be determined in all I did. Many people have criticized me. Some have called me an autocrat, a cruel dictator. But what is a dictator? It's someone who makes arbitrary, unilateral decisions, who acts over and above institutions, over and above the laws, who is under no restraint but his own desires and whims. I didn't make unilateral decisions. My functions existed within a collective. I had authority, of course, and influence for historical reasons, but I didn't give orders or rule by decree. As for cruelty, I really think that a man who has devoted his entire life to fighting injustice, oppressions of all kinds, to serving others, to fighting for others, to preaching and practicing solidarity, I think that all of that is totally incompatible with cruelty. Many years ago, a preacher told me that it is always the few who save the many. This was a proof of God's benevolent providence and a foundation for optimism about the future, however dark things now looked. The values instilled in religious community were faithfully reflected in my home. So was the emphasis on hard work. In my family, we were never idols, partly because idleness was a sin, partly because there was so much work to be done, and partly, no doubt, because we were that sort of people. Now, looking back on a lifetime of hard work, one is tempted to make an accounting of what those efforts may have wrought. Is this world a better world for my modest efforts? Of course, no humankind, nor indeed any conceivable computer, can calculate the sum total of my experiences in terms of happiness, achievement, and virtue, nor indeed of their opposites. It follows, therefore, that the full accounting of how my political work affected the life of others is something we will only know in Judgment Day. It is awesome and an unsettling thought, but it comforts me to think that when I stop And when I stand up to hear the verdict, I can at least depend on you all, good people, to serve as character witnesses. For that, I will be forever grateful. And I'd like to thank you all, with all my heart, for coming here today, listening to what I have to say. Thank you very much. Good night.